Hello everyone, today we talk about Edward I of England's reign and more specifically of his foreign policy. We already talked about the English conquest of Wales under Edward's reign that brought to the probably the integration of Wales within the kingdom of England. So you can check that video out if you're interested. I also made something about Welsh warfare about the same period, and there's definitely a lot of stuff we have to cover about that. We also talked about Edward's crusade, his commitment to the broader cause that in fact would have made him come back to the Levant hadn't eventually Acre fallen. Made a video about the siege of Acre of 1291 in the military history, say tactically analytical sense, and so you can check that out as well. Today we talk mostly about Edward's relations with the Mongols, with France, with Aragon in part, and with Scotland. So the great cause, right? The competition for the crown of Scotland, and in some other video, of course, we will. There's so much about Edward I, and technically this video here is part of the original series playlist, because for England, given sort of the greater compaction of the country and the relative subjection of the various provinces to the crown, like I couldn't differentiate so much, and I in terms of single regions, and I directed my effort more towards the sovereigns, right? And so we're covering a lot about Edward I because he's such a great ruler, and we will keep making many other videos on him even outside of this series. Regarding the Anglo and Franco-Mongol alliance, also one between the Mongols and other European polities, I made some video already in a general sense, the relation, I don't know, the Mongols also in the early, say, invasion period at this point. Most of it in Europe was over, and mostly just from the Golden Horde in Central Eastern Europe. But there had been lots of things going on. Frederick II, the papacy. Right at this point, the European powers are seeking essentially an alliance with the Mongols that are also tested as far as the possibility of their conversion to Christianity. Still at this point, something that will actually fail, as you know, but that was seen as a mean to the end of essentially crushing the Saracens, and more specifically at this point the Mamluks, in the broader Western crusading efforts in the Near East, as of course what remained of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as we were observing before with the final fall of Acre, and then just the last avant-post, the smaller avant-posts on the Levantine coast would exemplify, right? So this was really important at a political, strategical, and operational level, because, of course, like a direct support against the Mamluks in the Levant could properly allow for reconquest of the Holy Land, something at this point, again, many, say, European sovereigns were looking at with, say, cognition of cause, because it was practicable. Right, if you look at the same first expedition of Edward in the Levant, you know that this happened after the death of Louis IX. This major expedition that, had it succeeded, instead of being shipwrecked in Tunis with the plague, the death of the main leaders of the expedition, would have likely crushed Egypt and allowed for the Christian reconquest of Jerusalem. We are in the 13th century. Western European powers are at the top of their strength, and so really massive expeditions would have been possible had there been also just a greater commitment to the cause. And Edward definitely embodied that. Right, he was probably the most eager sovereign to embark, to desire to embark in such an enterprise. There were others that were sort of closer and sort of more up to the thing. For example, Charles of Anjou, that, as we will see now, in fact, would instead have to abort that. The conquest of Constantinople, just like it had happened in other times in Sicilian history, for example, with the death of Henry, the premature death of Henry VI, it was just like to march on Constantinople before, just 8 years later, the French and the Venetians would actually take it. At this point, Constantinople had fallen again into the hands of the Byzantines, who were trying to do anything possible to instead engulf the Mediterranean to prevent the Westerners to go east, because they knew that, as the Fourth Crusade had proven, that if it wasn't Jerusalem, it could be Constantinople, right? So Edward would never actually go on crusade again after his return to England in 1274 from the crusade, but he was intentioned to do so for quite a long time. In 1287, in fact, he even took a vow to go on another crusade, and so this was very binding politically. There was a lot of, at this point, really a lot of diplomacy in Europe going on, things getting ever more intertwined, like international communication, etc. And this intention would last until 1291. We will see mostly why this date, right? The main impediment to launch another crusade and or to simply embark the English sovereign into an expedition on his own, hopefully with some other ally, was, as we were saying now, the current situation, especially in the central Mediterranean. All right. In 1282, you know what happens in Sicily. The inhabitants of Palermo rise up against the Angevins in a orchestrated plot that had been essentially directed by the Aragonese and the Byzantines to, in fact, strip the Angevins of the Sicilian control. Charles of Anjou, also for controlling better the papacy and just having more direct contacts with the Balkans, had moved the the traditional center of the Sicilian monarchy from Palermo in Sicily to Naples on the Italian mainland, and this allowed for the Vespers to occur. Sicily had actually undergone like a general crisis due to first like the turmoils in the late, say, the Swabian era. Then the same Angevin conquest of southern Italy had sort of messed up things publicly and institutionally even more, even though it was an incredibly powerful state, right? Just very difficult to control directly, because the barons of the hinterland had essentially placed this very heavy toll for anyone who wanted to have a direct rule over the realm. And at this point, the Vespers also triggered some further destructuring and destabilization of the local economy. Many Sicilians go abroad, even serving, say, as Turcopoles in the Byzantine or Crusade world. We talk about this in some video about Romania, about Cyprus, etc. It's a very picturesque background. There is also a lot of naval warfare, a lot of piracy in the process. And in fact, during the War of the Sicilian Vespers, the War of the Vespers that followed, lasting 20 years until 1302, the same son of Charles of Anjou, that is Charles the Lame, Charles of Salerno, the actually future Charles II of Naples, was taken prisoner of Naples in a battle against the greatest admiral in medieval warfare. There is Roger of Lauria, that in fact, worked for the Aragonese, and by the way, against the very strict, precise warnings of his father that had told him, whatever happens, don't go at sea, and if Roger of Laurier is out there, you don't even come close to the shore. Instead, the guy was a bit complex. He wanted to show off a bit that he was capable, and of course he gets captured in the process, and Charles of Anjou even disowns him as his own son, and other dramatic stories. And this was actually threatening to engulf, the Mediterranean further, as the French, in order to support Naples, because they were the same, at least ruling house, and supported each other, planned an attack on Aragon, right? And this was like a serious issue. Eventually, like the French would actually engulf themselves in a war, as you know, with Philip III of France dying after the battle against the Aragonese, with this project properly of reconquering what had pertained historically to the county of Barcelona. And so what had historically been, and we talked about this in different videos, exactly talking about the relations between the French and the Spanish during the 13th century, in fact, to the Kingdom of France, to the former Western Frankish kingdom. And to make the long story short, as far as the English are concerned, of course, Edward immediately spent himself to, first of all, try to avoid war. Then this broke out anyway between the French and the Aragonese, and he thus also helped to broker in Paris, after actually the death of Philip III, in fact, because Philip IV would want actually to bail out of that. He would involve himself into Flanders, actually triggering, as you know, that greater issue with the same England that was yet to come as a problem. It was not the only one, by the way, between the English and the French still, to probably broker a truce between France and Aragon. That also helped secure Charles the Lame, Charles of Salerno's release. Right. At this point, Edward was still thinking the crusade to be possible again, but all the major indicators were going worse for it, and the reason why the crusade was actually stopped was the actual fall of Acre in 1291. Simple as that. The Mamluks captured the last stronghold, de facto the center at that point of the kingdom of Jerusalem, after, of course, the fall of Jerusalem had occurred quite earlier on. Yes, there had been that deal brokered by Frederick II for a while, but that was not really a reconquest. And so without that point d'appui, there was really not much that Edward could do anymore in the Levant, because the Mamluks had really secured the scene. They would also manage to defeat the Mongols. And so this is really consolidating their power in Syria and Palestine beyond their Egyptian bases. Now, Edward, at this point, resized a bit his interest, and he turned it especially towards the Duchy of Gascony. I made a video about this polity for our regional historical series. You know what was the deal. These were territories that the English had managed to take. The English royal house dynasty had managed to maintain in France after the loss of most territories in the continent that had belonged to the Angevin dynasty that we're talking about here, Edward being, as you know, St. John of England's grandchild. And that always involved the issue of swearing fealty as vassals to the kings of France. That obviously required some, political statements and behaviors and postures that would affect the relation, the events in the respective countries. In 1278, Edward assigns an investigating commission to his trusted associates Otto the grandson and the Chancellor Robert Bernal. We're talking about the Chancellor of England, Lord High, and this replaced, by the way, the former figure in this role. It was the Seneschal Luc de Tanny. Now, Otto the grandson is an interesting figure in particular because this guy had already been sent by Edward to the Holy Land to capitanate the remaining English knights of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, also sort of preparing for the Mamluk onslaught before the siege of Acre. Otto the grandson was a Savoyard, right? This group, right, of knights essentially from the county of Savoy had been, as you know, quite important during Henry III's reign, and had become a powerful faction at the English court, often against the same sort of native English nobility, the unruly barons, and they had been a bit like the factotum of the English kings. They had often been sent on the continent, also in fact in the Guyenne, to to manage the local affairs, also because they were French themselves. And at this point, really, you can argue that still, of course, the same English kings are French. Now, in 1286, Edward visited himself Gascony, remaining in the region for 3 years. So he first had the survey, realized what essentially he needed to prepare to be done, and then he went there himself. And this was really normal, like to tour the various possessions of the crown, being maintained by the local estates. This could relieve a bit England, that was at least the country in which there could be a greater position, if anything, because Gascony was instead more depending on their on its own autonomy, on the effect of this foreign presence as opposed to the French crown. And then in exchange for this cost, like the sovereign would essentially grant certain further autonomies, but by co-opting the locals into the government, therefore making it easier to control this place. And as you know, throughout also the 100 Years' War, this is essentially an English base of operation for the chevauchée in the French hinterland, etc. On Easter Sunday, 1287, Edward almost got himself killed. He was standing in a tower when the wooden floor collapsed. Right, this massive, stone buildings, but inside, of course, the structures were removable, and he fell for more than 20 meters. Right, he broke his collarbone, and he would be confined to bed for several months. Right, and this kind of incidents were actually quite serious for considering the medical capacity of the time. Think just about the possible infections with broken bones and whatever. Several other people died in the accident, by the way, and shortly after he regained his, sanity, Edward ordered the local Gascon Jews to be expelled from the country. This was seemingly sort of, thanks to God for his recovery. This is at least how it's been interpreted. We'll talk more about the Jews in England, in France, in other videos, because it's always an interesting topic. Now, as we were saying, the main issue connected with Gascony was the relation between England and France, right? And specifically the role of vassalage that ruling over Gascony was imposed onto the English monarch by the French crown. That really thus considered such territory in theory removable from the direct control of Edward. There was a diplomatic mission in 1286 in which the English king would pay homage to the new French one, that, as we've seen, was Philip IV, Philip the Fair. There was a strange situation, especially following the emergence of piracy, in a sort of undeclared war going on between at least the sailors of England, Gascony, Normandy, and other French areas in 1293. So this brought Edward's brother, Edmund Crouchback, to actually allow, for the sake of security in the area, because this was infested by pirates, Philip IV's forces to occupy properly Gascony. And we're talking about chief fortresses that, of course, were the most important sort of strategic deal in the warfare of the time and for the control of a territory in the first place. This was done in a way to prove that Edward was well disposed towards Philip, since some French ships had been captured by these local Gascon pirates, and the same port of La Rochelle had been sacked during such clashes, so causing important damage to French economy. At that point, Philip seized the opportunity to refuse actually to release the fortresses that had been handed over him in Gascony, and actually going as far as declaring Gascony itself forfeit when Edward refused to appear before him again in Paris, which was sort of a mobbing demand, a recognition of French authority, and so essentially treating the English monarch as not as a peer, but as a subordinate in virtue of the vassalic connections that were. And this was extremely important, even in a formal point of view, because morally speaking, what these actions showed is how strong or weak a sovereign really was and what kind of control he had on these territories. And obviously this piracy had been an embarrassment for those who had to control it from Gascony, especially when damaging the French trade interests. It is while in Gascony that Edward engaged in diplomatic relations with the Mongol court of the Ilkhanate of Persia, right? This, as you know, was one of the massive but still ramp states to which the Mongol Empire had been disintegrating, been regionalizing, essentially. And the Ilkhanate made multiple videos on the Ilkhanate, on some even expeditions in Syria, exemplifying Mongol logistical issues and more, right? So we'll keep talking about the White Khanate. And this regional actor was, of course, the one that was fighting the most against the Mamluks, and more involved, in fact, in the Jazeera and in Syria, and opening to the possibility of Mediterranean contact, of joint effort to even try to, ideally at least, to recover Jerusalem. Edward had already had contact with the Ilkhans while he was himself in the Levant, right? This would be obvious. And Edward had received So this Mongol Persian envoys at his court in Gascony were in 1287, and one of the leaders of this delegation was Rabban Bar Sauma, a Uyghur or on-good monk turned diplomat of the Nestorian Church of the East in China, that would actually embark himself on a pilgrimage from Yuan, China to Jerusalem, and so knew pretty well, like also the Ilkhanate, Baghdad, right? So, and allowed us, by the way, to document through a recorded account the interaction between the English and the Mongols. We know of other Ilkhanate embassies arriving in Europe in 1289 and 1289. At this point, the Khanate was ruled by Abaka, who offered spontaneously forces to launch a coordinated attack against the Mamluks, together with the Crusaders, right? And he offered also to supply the latter with horses that, as we know, were not lacking in the Mongol armies. They moved with literally hundreds of thousands of horses, only a part of which, of course, was delegated for fighting. But this is also what the Mongol logistics relied on, and this is quite interesting. Imagine, of course, Western knights, let's say, fighting on Mongol Persian mounts. It's interesting. And Edward was pretty glad about this. He actually, we're still, you see here, before 1291, the fall of Acre. So he worked at this point to receive a papal approval for launching this expedition, receiving further support. It was a huge issue of money, mostly. But again, things would be cut short quite soon. Nevertheless, Edward sent Geoffrey of Langley, who was a knight, an ambassador, that had participated in the crusade of Edward in the Holy Land in the years 1270-71, as an ambassador, in fact, as an envoy to the Mongols, right? And revealing in this sense how concrete this English-Mongol alliance was being brokered in function of essentially the freeing, or at least of parts of Levant from the Mamluks. Then, of course, what the the Mongol arrangements would have been, it's a bit more complicated to decide, because at that point the rulers probably started fighting against one another. There was a sad event in Edward's life, that is the death of Eleanor of Castile on November the 28th, 1290. This was his wife of from 36 years. She had really helped him tremendously, just like Henry III. Edward was a very a good husband. He cared very much about his wife, and he was deeply affected by her death. He had been faithful throughout their marriage. This is not to be given for granted, because it's not just that most marriages were historically arranged. We'll never fully know what their true feelings really were in the case, but there was a role to perform, and even though, say, male infidelity was considered, especially in that position, like less than the female one, Edward remained faithful to his wife. And this also gave place to a landmark of England, that are the Eleanor crosses. There are these 12 tall and lavishly decorated stone monuments, topped with crosses, scattered across the path that goes from Lincoln to Westminster, and that were placed essentially at every night stop that the funerary cortege would stop at every day in remembrance of Eleanor. There were peace accords between England and France in 1294, which had essentially established that Edward now would have to marry again with Philip IV's half-sister Margaret, who was who in fact became the Queen Consort of England. She was the daughter of Philip III of France and Maria of Brabant. In any case, this marriage was delayed by the outbreak of the war. All right. In the meanwhile, Edward was trying to seek the support of France's eastern neighbors to fight exactly against the Valois, because, as you understand here, the situation was pretty tense. In the first place, it was always a state of quasi-war, essentially. And we're talking about, however, some relatively scattered actors. The current King of Germany, Adolf of Nassau, that, yes, was sort of powerful in his own way, but had basically just stripped the crown from the Habsburgs, and as you know, Germany, especially at this point, was engulfed in a pretty sorrow mess. He was we talk about the Nassaus in a video about the German dynasties of the period, and there wasn't excessively much that could be done for him to intervene against France in this period. More useful was the contact with Guy of Dampierre, the Count of Flanders, who, as we will see, took action against the French. Reginald I of Gelders, Count of Gelders, and even Robert II of Burgundy, that was at this point also the titular king of Thessalonica. I have, by the way, a bit about the Thessalonican army organization during the later Middle Ages. I made a video about the Duchy of Burgundy, and you know that this was essentially a sort of copy of the French state, a bit in miniature at this point considering the extension. It, however, had managed by essentially constitution to secure the impossibility of essentially subsumption of the duchy by the French crown that would occur only very later on, right? And the purpose of all these allies of Edward was to assist him in attacking France. But all these agreements, as we've seen here, for different reasons, proved practically volatile. And Edward, at this point, was also starting to have issues at home because Wales and Scotland, as we'll see now, had started giving problems. Edward's man at this point in Gascony was Barrau de Sescas. This was essentially a knight in English service, and during the war between Philip IV and Edward I, Barrau became the essentially the admiral proposed to the fleet of Bayonne, and therefore tasked with the duty of keeping Gascony supplied, carrying out in part also those piratical activities in and around the Gascon coast, right? It's not before August 1297 that Barrau could also reach the Flemish that had been, as we've seen with Guy of Dampierre, fighting against the French and supplying them, supporting them. Besides, it was too late because the French had defeated the Flemish forces at the Battle of Furnes, fought on August the 20th, 1297. This had been like remarkably bloody battle, right? The French were led by Robert II of Artois, the son of Robert, Philip, was gravely wounded during the engagement. He would die shortly afterwards. I made a video about the House of Artois, if you're interested, also in the dispute going on here between Artois and Flanders. Also, Walram, the Count of Jülich, had been killed from the Flemish side, and therefore this tells you how bloody an engagement this had really been for this important nobleman to fall into it. Also for people who said that these were not much bloody encounters during the Middle Ages. They killed each other as hell, even among noblemen. Plus, Adolf of Nassau never sent support, as we were saying before, from Germany. Edward was essentially left alone, as he felt a bit surrounded also by the issues going on in the Celtic fringe. The French were very strong at this point under Philip IV. France has the highest might ever reached during the Middle Ages. So there is the Treaty of Montreuil and Chartres in 1219, bringing to essentially a further connection between the French and the English. Actually, the war was not really over completely. This is the Gascony War. It would be fought between 1294 and 1303. But this treaty of Montreuil-sur-Mer was particularly relevant because it brought to the betrothal of Edward's son, the Prince Edward of Cernarborn, the future Edward II, with Philip's daughter Isabella, that she would be, repugnantly surnamed, like later on in sort of pretty petty historiography, as the She-Wolf of France. It was actually a very capable figure. We will talk about her at some point. She's the Sophie Marceau in Braveheart, right? Just for the record. And of course, that's not quite much of a historical movie, but she's an important figure. And she really, again, we'll talk about Edward II's reign, and we talked also about the Edward II War's rule of Aquitaine. Right? So if you search for that video, you will find more information about her, her lover, and how things essentially went downhill for Edward II, also because of her. So there was essentially at this point an armistice, right? Edward married at this point Philip's half-sister, and at the end of the day, the French sort of, profited from this mostly because the English had really lost so many resources for nothing at this point. And as we've seen, Philip had not really handed over back like the Gascon fortresses, which would, however, occur in the final Treaty of Paris of 1303, at which point at least parts of Gascony were returned to the English as a French fief. So technically not the English crown, at least because individually the Gascon ruler was also crowned with the English title, of course. And this tells you also like the degree of power that the French had been enjoying in this situation. Now, passing to the competition for the crown of Scotland as a prelude to the Scottish Wars, effectively, the Wars of Scottish Independence. made a video about the Battle of Stirling Bridge, which is a very interesting one in the history of warfare. So that's, I think, the only thing I ever made about the Scottish Wars of Independence, and except like those videos about Scottish history in general. So surely we will make a lot of stuff about those, because I'm planning to expand a bit. Also, never talked really much about campaigns as well, wars in general, single sort of evidential topics. Normally talk either about single battles and or the sort of other broader contexts, but I think this channel would benefit from it. Now, up to this point, as you know, historically Scotland had remained very much dependent on England in spite of its decentralization and autonomy. This simply because England was more advanced, more powerful. The Scottish lowlands had been heavily Normanized, anglicized historically, and sort of developing on the basis of, in fact, the English influence. I made a video on Davidian Scotland, the Scoto-Normans, so we will, of course, come back on the topic. And actually, and this is really normal because it makes you, of course, there was some sort of conflict and competition between the two crowns, but of course, like some even big events in historical hindsight, like start sometimes from situations were not really that critical up to a few times before. In fact, you can argue that during the 80s of the 13th century, like England and Scotland were kind of doing okay. There were contexts, there were peaceful relations, everything was flowing smoothly. There was historically the issue of the homage, right? That was always like, you know, a form of recognition, essentially, of Scottish dependency on the English rulers as the strongest ones. I consider that at this point Edward has been conquering Wales, so that was really a brutal, really annexation properly to the French crown of this country of the Celtic French that would in fact not go on like, say, Scotland or Ireland as a single country in historical perspective. And this, of course, had alarmed the other Celts. I made some videos about also Ireland in this perspective, and we'll have to look at the Scottish one a bit more insightfully. In 1278, the King Alexander III of Scotland paid homage to Edward I. By the way, Alexander was Edward's brother-in-law, but apparently this recognition of English, right, so of homage to the English, pertained only to Alexander's possessions in England that were, of course, in his say, at least nominal control. Problems would arise, if anything, in the early 90s with the famous succession crisis. Alexander died in 1286, and he left as heir to the Scottish throne Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway. As at this point she was 3 years old, only like the sole surviving descendant of Alexander, and she essentially became the Queen Designate of Scotland from 1286 until her death, that would occur when she was only 7 years old, as you will see. And the girl was known as the Maid of Norway because she was Alexander's granddaughter, and through his daughter Margaret, who had married Eric II of Norway. If you're interested in the Norwegian-Scottish relations, I made a video about the Battle of Largs. I talked about the broader issue of the crown, like Scotland with the Isles, and we'll come back on that. So this was the only surviving descendant of Alexander, so she was sent to Scotland to marry. At this point, the 6-year-old would be Edward II, Edward of Cernerforn. They were the same age, essentially. This was agreed at the Treaty of Berkham, also known as Salisbury. In fact, were two treaties that were intended to secure the independence of Scotland after the death of Alexander. And this would also include the accession of the 3-year-old granddaughter Margaret, Maid of Norway. This would still entail Scotland to remain free of English overlordship. So the idea was essentially to have her married as the would-be Queen of Scotland to the heir designated to the throne of England, to achieve some sort of also unification and, or say, in a certain sense of dynastic collection, not the unification, of course, of the two countries, and so to support also Scotland in its development. So the sad aspect, of course, of this is that when sailing from Norway to Scotland in the autumn of 1290, Margaret fell ill and died in Orkney. She was just like, I think not even 7 years old, she was like 6 or 7, I don't remember. So this, of course, as dark and tragic, also brought to greater problems for Scotland, because the country at this point was without an obvious heir, right? Scotland had been developing as a feudal monarchy at this point, but it was a bit less of a feudal system than others. The surplus was scarce, there was not much of a great centralization, and the various clans of Scotland had all great ambitions that were also connected to this, again, less hierarchical sense of power, and this more like collective choice by the nobility, unlike England, that was much, in comparison, much more heavily hierarchical, in spite of the Magna Carta, like the Baronian prerogatives, and so on, incomparably so. So this triggered what is called like the Great Cause, so the competition for the crown of Scotland. There were really many competitors. I will see them now, mostly John Balliol, the Lord of Galloway, Robert the Bruce, the 5th Lord of Annandale, but there were other figures like John Hastings, the 1st Baron of Hastings, Floris the 5th, Count of Holland, so it was really an international thing, John the Black Comyn, Lord of Badenoch, and more. This tells you alone how complicated the situation really was, because of course Scotland was willing also to negotiate like some sort of foreign monarchic presence, just to, like as other countries did, just to maintain power in the hands of the nobility rather than having a strong local ruler. Naturally, things for literal needs of survival evolved in another direction. The Scots, by the way, trusted Edward to lead the procedures and sort of managing the outcome of what was turning to be like essentially an elective process, which Edward, from his side, wanted, of course, to act as not just as an arbiter, but obviously someone who could influence and obviously appoint like a guy that would follow like his own policy. All right. He wasn't required, however, to be an arbiter in the dispute specifically. That is to say, the sense the Scots were aware that they should have decided about the next king of Scotland by themselves in a process that was not to be at least directly influenced, formally, institutionally influenced by the King of England, in spite of the homage that was rendered, by the way, also considered by some, like just personally by a single ruler, not much by the rest of the Scottish nobility. The election would be made by 104 auditors. who were appointed by the most important figures involved here. And essentially there were already like two parties, just by the numbers, the subdivision, you realize there are two parties involved. 40 auditors were appointed by Balliol, John Balliol, 40 by Robert de Bruce. Robert de Bruce, the 5th Lord of Annandale, is essentially grandfather of Robert I of Scotland, right? That would come to rule later. And Edward was given the opportunity of appointing 24 auditors from, and these were essentially from the senior members of the Scottish political community. This tells you already like the degree of influence, of course, Edward had, but also one that was to leave, ideally, just like the majority in control of the Scots nominally. So at Birmingham, with the also prospect of, as we've seen, through the, let's say, of a personal union between the two realms, right? The question of suzerainty had not really been considered so much by Edward per se, because even if that had been achieved with an Englishman on the Scottish throne, or as we've seen, even a marriage like whereby like I don't know, the Queen Consort of England would have been also the Queen of Scotland. Like of course, the prospect of a direct English intervention, direct control, was not on the fore yet, right? This was a political crisis, but it had not yet escalated, which would, as you will see here, happen in some years instead. Edward insisted that were he to settle the contest, this had to bring to his recognition rather as Scotland's feudal overlord. In other words, he remained sort of liberal as far as the decision was internally to be made, but this, given that, of course, the debate seemed very difficult, and possibly even to speed up the process that was bringing also some cost to England as well, he said that, okay, like if the thing does not unlock, just know that I will decide, and at that point Scotland will automatically become some sort of vassal of the English crown as a consequence. In fact, the Scots did not want at all this to happen, but they were living in this sort of gray area for which they claimed that since the country had literally no king at this point, as nobody was really identified as one, nor having the authority to make this make this decision to proclaim that, there wasn't really anything that anyone could do, which is apparently a paradoxical issue. And the impasse was surpassed, at least formally, by essentially agreeing that the realm would be handed over to Edward until a rightful heir to its throne would have been found, right? So the English managed to pressure the Scots to say, okay, like, do it quickly, otherwise, until now, at least, of course, a headless country doesn't have that much negotiation capacity as well. And so there is this lengthy hearing that leads to the final appointment of John Balliol on November 17th, 1292. Edward continued, even after Balliol's accession to the Scottish throne, to act authoritatively towards Scotland, to the point of like causing at this point some alarm, right, and objection from the side of the Scots. For example, Edward agreed to hear appeals on cases ruled on by the Court of Guardians that had governed Scotland during this interregnum, which seemed like, why does this guy have to do it, especially now that the King of Scotland is being found. Of course, Edward was taking advantage of the situation, like forcing hand to test essentially as far as he could push. There is other instance in which Macduff, the son of Malcolm II, Malcolm II, the ruler of the earldom of Fife between 1288 and 1266, in which this guy accused Balliol of a crime, and Edward posed himself as the arbiter and actually asked the same Balliol, remember, the guy who had been appointed to Scottish kingship, to present himself in person before the English Parliament to answer of the accusations. And the interesting thing is that John Balliol, this tells you also a lot how powerful the English were at this point over Scotland, obeyed, right? The final straw was rather the fact, in this already humiliating situation, the King of England demanding the Scottish magnates to provide military service in the war against France, as if they were just, being commanded by the King of England, right? That was treating essentially Scotland now as a feudal possession of some sort. And this, of course, again, was really Edward wanting to test the untestable in a sense, because it would turn out to be unacceptable. As an answer to the English demands, the Scots instead formed, exactly at this point in history, the Old Alliance, right? That was really made in 1295 in this Scottish-French direction against England. They wouldn't stop to that. The Scots attacked the same England, launching an unsuccessful attack on Carlisle in Cumbria. This was really like also a pretty inconsiderate move to some extent. Edward at that point had essentially the motivation to invade the same Scotland in response, which occurred the year after. In fact, in 1296, the English took the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed, bringing to the sack of the city and the consequent massacre of civilians that was counted in the thousands, at least. This was a display, of course, of the English ferocity, but also the sort of iron-fistedly secure, confident policy of Edward regarding Scotland at this point. This is we'll talk again in part, of course, about the just the following events. For example, the Battle of Dunbar, in which the Scots were crushed, opening to the English domination of the Scottish lowlands. But also what were, you see here, the perspectives historically throughout the 13th century of England, boxed essentially into Britain by the French exploit, like the true blossoming the continent with the loss of, say, most possessions from the Angevin side in the process, and the necessity for the English to spend their force against the Celtic French. After all, Wales was conquered for good. Yes, it would be the rebellions historically, we'll talk about them, but that was a hell of an enormous accomplishment. Edward, as you know, we made the video about the topic. Like, he massively fortified this land. It was a major accomplishment in Scotland. In historical perspective, just since Anglo-Saxon times, understood by the English as their own subject, right? The English had truly an imperial vocation that was also shared in a truly traditional sense together with other sense of the empire in Europe. Like, we forget the British Empire, the Bretwalda, the sense that from the first time that the Anglo-Saxons set foot in Britain, they understood everything in the British archipelago to be theirs, right, as a chosen people. And this was just in many ways like the consequence of a much longer term process that would bring the English, in fact, to attempt at least the conquest of Scotland. And you can argue that in historical perspective, also the mid-14th century crisis helped the Scots, that were, however, capable, of course, of resisting and proving that they could essentially be at the same level of England in international strength, recognition, relations, as a true people on their own. And so this is what, say, the alchemy that makes the Scottish Wars of Independence so interesting in perspective. And we will hopefully look at this much more in depth. By the way, this went along, like, by Edward's side, there was no doubt of the intention. For example, the English sovereign confiscated the stone of Scone, the stone of destiny. This, as you know very well, to my British audience especially, this oblong block of red sandstone. It was used in the coronation of the Scottish monarchs until the 13th century. In fact, you have still a coronation chair, also known as St. Edward's or King Edward's I, that was created expressly by Edward I, who commissioned it in 1296 to contain the stone of Scone, which he had captured from the Scots. And so this was essentially like the idea that he would literally sit on it. And you know, the coronation chair was last used at the coronation of King Charles III and his consort at Westminster Abbey in 2023. So, of course, like, you know, the stone of Scone was given back to Scotland, but only in 1996. Today it's at Edinburgh Castle, with the honors of Scotland, and in spite, of course, like the fact that there is a united kingdom and a Great Britain, still that sort of recognition of course Scottish identity through this Chimelium really is quite meaningful. And it does bring us back very strongly to Edward I's times, because it's exactly when the issue had belonged, right? So this is really fascinating. In fact, Edward was the one who brought the Scottish Stone of Destiny to Westminster. Also, in the process, he deposed John Balliol and placed him nowhere else than in the Tower of London, installing at that point Englishmen to govern the country, right? And by that point, like, this had been overwhelming success, one of the greatest in medieval history if you look at it. Except, of course, this triumph would just be short-lived, and we will see it in another video. But this is literally how straightforwardly it began, right? And as you've seen, like, escalating quickly. And of course, we should make multiple videos to explain really how this was also thought, motivated, legitimized, etc. Because, of course, things are not just like merely, I don't know, the English were tyrants and that's it. Like, there were some greater implications, probably in the traditional medieval way, and in the relations between England and Scotland should be pointed out at that point for this moment in history. So again, talking about Edward I is always very the hammer of the Scots, Longshank, like very interesting for me. And however, I stop it here for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.